It was an ordinary morning in Springfield, with golden sunlight filtering through the windows of the corner cafe, where Mr. Walter usually enjoyed his black coffee with 2 slices of toast. At 78, he maintained a simple routine, marked by slow steps and a brown hat faded with age. That day, however, carried an eerie silence. As he left home, Walter had a mission: to resolve a problem at the bank. He just didn't imagine that his simple trip there would turn into an unforgettable scene. The bank branch was 2 blocks from his home, a red brick building with automatic glass doors. He went there every first Monday of the month to withdraw money that helped his daughter and grandchildren's finances. At the entrance, he straightened his shirt collar and straightened his hat. But as he approached the revolving door, it jammed. And no one moved to help him. Before I continue, I want to say that I ask God to bless you with all His infinite love, giving you much health, peace, joy, and faith, for we can never lose faith in God, for He will never abandon us, for His love is eternal and infinite. I also want to take this opportunity to ask that you like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps me a lot, thank you. Now, get ready, because what happens next? You simply won't believe it. Walter tried again, pushing the door calmly, thinking it might just be a momentary error. But the door wouldn't budge. A security guard inside looked at him suspiciously and gave him a subtle nod, as if to say, "Hold on." The man, with his careful gait, took a step back. Inside, he felt his heart beat faster. Something was wrong. Minutes passed. 3, 4, 5. People came and went as usual. But the door seemed locked just for him. Walter looked around, searching for a familiar face, but everyone hurried past. The other security guard whispered something into the radio. The feeling of being watched crept into his chest. It was as if he were an intruder, an invader. And he, a man who had once fought for this country, now couldn't enter a bank? A middle-aged woman in a blue suit walked right through the door without a hitch. Walter tried to speak to her, but she just looked away. It was then that he felt a hand touch his arm. It was his granddaughter, Emily, running from across the street. She was 22 and worked part-time as an assistant in a flower shop. When she saw her grandfather standing outside, she frowned. "Grandpa, why are you still out here?" she asked worriedly. He just shook his head, pointing to the security guards inside. "They won't let me in, honey," he said, his voice breaking. Emily, who inherited her mother's strong temper, didn't hesitate. She marched up to the entrance, looked the security guard straight in the eye, and said, "Why can't my grandfather come in?" The man didn't answer. Emily insisted, her voice louder now. "Is there a problem with him? He's been a customer at this bank for over 30 years. The security guard looked away, looking nervous. A second security guard approached, trying to defuse the situation. But Emily wouldn't back down. Walter, outside, felt his face heat up. He had never felt so humiliated in his entire life. And then, from the back of the agency, a figure emerged with firm steps. It was the manager. Her name was Lisa, a woman in her early 40s, with brown hair tied back in an elegant bun and eyes that scanned everything with precision. As she approached the door, she noticed the embarrassment on the employees' faces. Walter vaguely recognized her, but he wasn't sure from where. Lisa asked for the door to be unlocked. The security guards hesitated, but complied. Emily went through first, pulling her grandfather by the hand. Everyone inside the bank watched. Some with pity, others with discomfort, and the rest with indifference. The silence was palpable. Lisa, however, stared at Walter as if trying to fit a piece of an ancient puzzle together. "Mr. Walter, I'm sorry about this," she said calmly. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." But her expression betrayed something more. It was as if the scene had awakened a hidden memory. Emily crossed her arms, still irritated. What kind of misunderstanding prevents an elderly man from entering the bank on a Monday? The manager took a deep breath. She asked Walter to accompany her to her office. Inside, the atmosphere was calmer. Paintings of California landscapes decorated the walls, and a delicate wooden cross rested on the desk. Lisa sat down and asked him to show her his documents. Walter, still embarrassed, took his worn wallet from his pocket and handed it to her. She opened her wallet delicately, as if leafing through a holy book. Inside were an old ID card, a bank card, and a small, faded photo of Walter and his wife, taken at the Grand Canyon in 1973. Lisa stopped at the photo. Her eyes widened. She took the image in her hands and was silent for a few seconds. "This woman," she said slowly. "Is she your wife?" Walter nodded, his eyes welling up. "She passed away 5 years ago," he replied. Lisa blinked several times, as if trying to gather her thoughts. "Mr. Walter, I think I knew your wife. When I was a kid. At church camp in Idaho. She saved me from drowning." Walter's eyes widened. Emily was also shocked. Manager Lisa stood up slowly, as if rediscovering a forgotten piece of her own history. "Her name was Margaret, right? Everyone called her Maggie. She was the youth counselor that summer. I've never forgotten what she did for me." The room was filled with hushed emotion. Emily held her grandfather's hand, overcome with emotion. Walter simply nodded, surprised. Lisa composed herself. "I'm sorry about all this, Mr. Walter. This agency owes your family a great debt, more than anyone here could ever imagine." And then, with a firm gesture, she left the room and returned to the salon. There, she called all the employees and clients present. What she did next, no one expected. The silence in that bank branch was different. It wasn't the usual silence of people focused on their business. It was the kind of heavy silence, laden with guilt, shame, and a certain discomfort that few had the courage to face. The 2 security guards, who had seemed so resolute moments before, now avoided any eye contact with Walter or his granddaughter. Their hands trembled slightly, but pride kept them standing. Walter, even sitting in the manager's office, could sense something had broken there. And it wasn't just him. It was everyone. It was as if the situation had ripped a blindfold from everyone there. He was looking at Emily, who was now watching in silence, her eyes brimming with tears. What hurt Walter most wasn't the locked door. It was the judgmental look he received. And worst of all, the cruel silence of those who had the power to speak but chose to remain silent. At reception, the atmosphere began to change. Some customers discreetly left the room, while others whispered among themselves. A man in a gray suit stood next to the ATM, looking uncomfortable. Lisa, the manager, returned from the reception area and noticed the tension in the air. She knew she had to do something. But she didn't imagine that by confronting her own employees, she would unearth a secret that had been kept for years. "Marshall," she said, calling over the older security guard. He was about 50, with graying hair and hard eyes. "Can you please explain to me why Mr. Walter was denied entry today?" Marshall hesitated. He swallowed hard. He looked at his younger colleague, Brandon, who looked away. Lisa kept her tone firm. "I want the truth, and I want it now." Marshall tried to justify himself. He said he'd received a suspicious behavior alert regarding an elderly man in a brown hat. Lisa interrupted him. "And you thought it was him? A man who's been coming to this bank for over 30 years? Who greets employees by name? Does that make any sense to you, Marshall?" The security guard lowered his head. For the first time, Walter saw regret on his face. The youngest, Brandon, looked even more uncomfortable. He approached the manager and said quietly, "The truth is, we were instructed to watch out for anyone outside the standard profile. I thought it was just a precaution. I didn't think it was meant to block someone like that." Lisa's eyes widened. This wasn't just a glitch. It was an unwritten directive. And she knew exactly who was behind it. Lisa excused herself, looking upstairs toward the regional director's office. His name was Mr. Hawthorne, a demanding man, obsessed with image and reputation. Lisa had never directly challenged his decisions, but in that moment, something had shifted within her. She turned to the clients and said, "Please hold. The bank is temporarily on hiatus for internal reasons." And she walked up the stairs with determined strides. Walter stood there in the lobby, as everyone looked at him with a new expression. It was no longer judgmental. It was thoughtful. It was uncomfortable. Emily took his hand, squeezing it affectionately. "Are you okay, Grandpa?" she asked. He just smiled sideways. "It's not the first time someone's looked at me like that, dear. But maybe it'll be the last." There was something prophetic in those words. Lisa entered Hawthorne's office without knocking. The man, sitting in his leather chair, raised an eyebrow. "Is there a problem, Lisa?" She didn't answer immediately. She simply tossed Walter's wallet, open to Maggie's photo, onto the table. Hawthorne didn't understand. This man was barred from the bank today, due to risk profile guidelines. Guidelines that, from what Brandon said, came directly from you. Hawthorne tried to dodge, saying it was standard protocol. But Lisa wouldn't let it slide. Did you know who he was? His story? What his wife meant to the community? Did you know he's a Navy veteran? That he's helped raise funds for the local children's hospital for decades? The director fell silent. Lisa continued. And even if he wasn't anyone, he's a human being. An elderly man. That's enough. Downstairs, the employees looked at Walter with a mixture of shame and admiration. Marshall, the older security guard, approached slowly. He stopped in front of Walter and removed his cap. "I'm sorry, Mr. Walter. I was unfair. I was blind. There's no excuse, only shame." Walter calmly replied, "I accept your words, son. But don't forget them tomorrow." Brandon approached next. "Sir, I just wanted to keep people safe. But I realized that sometimes, when we try too hard to protect, we end up hurting the wrong people." Walter looked at him tenderly. "The world has hurt me enough, kid. But you still have time to make a difference." And it was at that moment that the entire agency seemed to breathe differently. Lisa came downstairs minutes later, her face serious. She called the employees closer and made a brief announcement. "Starting today, any policy involving appearance judgment is revoked. Everyone here must be treated with dignity, no matter who they are. Our bank must be a place of respect, not exclusion. This isn't just an internal correction. It's a change in attitude." A timid applause erupted from the remaining customers. An elderly man rose from his chair and removed his hat in honor of Walter. A young woman handed him a rose from her bouquet. Emily couldn't hold back her tears. And then, in a surprising gesture, Walter stood and said, "I'd like to say something, if you'll allow me." Everyone fell silent. The sound from the bank faded. It was as if even the clocks had stopped. "I've been through a lot in this life. Wars, goodbyes, losses, joys. But I never thought I'd have to teach adults to look an elderly person in the eye with respect. I was treated like a nuisance today. But I was also heard. And that's what changes the game. Listening." He continued, "I'm not here for money. I'm here for dignity. I'm just an ordinary man. But my wife, Maggie, she was extraordinary. And for her sake, I demand that you look upon others as she did, with compassion." Lisa fought back tears. The silence was different now, one of reverence. Even Hawthorne, watching from upstairs, couldn't hide his shock. Emily hugged him tightly. "You were amazing, Grandpa," she said. And Walter, with a tired smile, replied, "No, honey. I was just who I've always been. Today the world finally saw me." At that moment, someone clapped. Then another. And another. Until the entire agency was in applause. But there was still more to be revealed. Something hidden in the past, which would surface at the most unexpected moment. What no one there knew was that Maggie had left something behind. Something that was about to change not only their day, but the history of that place. Emily had always admired her grandfather. To her, Walter was more than a war veteran or a man of faith. He was a role model for quiet courage, the kind of man who patiently resolved everything, even when everything around him seemed unfair. But that day, something inside her shifted. Seeing her grandfather treated like a nobody ignited a flame she hadn't even known she had. At the flower shop where she worked, Emily was known for her sweetness. She had a calm way with customers and a smile that charmed even the grumpiest. But anyone who saw her at that moment, with her fists clenched and her breathing heavy, would see a different side of her. A side that refused to accept the idea that elderly people should silently accept certain humiliations. She decided she wouldn't let this go unnoticed. Walter tried to calm her. "Never mind, dear. It's over." But Emily shook her head firmly. "It's not over, Grandpa. It can't be over. You're not just anyone. And even if you were, no one deserves to be treated like this. The young woman had something that came from younger generations, an urgency for justice. But, unlike many, she also had something rare, a sensitivity to listen to others. Without saying anything to her grandfather, Emily opened her phone and began recording a video. She spoke simply but firmly, "This is my grandfather, Walter. A man who served this country with honor, raised his family with love, and never disrespected anyone. Today, he was denied entry to the bank. Why? Because he's old? Because he walks slowly? Because he doesn't seem trustworthy? Is that acceptable in the 21st century?" The video went viral faster than she imagined. Within hours, thousands of views, comments, and shares began to pour in. People across the country identified with the story. Children who saw their parents go through this. Grandparents who wept in silence. Strangers who were outraged. Walter's story was no longer just his. It was everyone's. But what no one expected was what came next. A producer from a Christian YouTube channel that produced true stories with inspiring endings contacted Emily. "Your story touched our team. Your grandfather's faith, his courage, the symbolism of it all, it needs to be told." Emily hesitated. Walter didn't like to expose himself. But when she told him, something unexpected happened. Walter said yes. "If this can help other people get back on their feet, then that's what I'm here for, my daughter." Emily hugged her grandfather tightly. "Let's do this right, then." And so, with the help of friends, she began organizing an interview with the network. But in the meantime, she also decided to return to the bank. Only this time, not as a granddaughter, but as a citizen who doesn't tolerate injustice. She requested a meeting with manager Lisa. Once there, she was greeted politely but with some caution. Lisa was aware of the impact of the video. Still, she maintained a professional demeanor. "Emily, I understand your frustration, and I've already taken internal action." But Emily went further. Action doesn't erase what happened. What will you do to ensure this doesn't happen again? To anyone else? Lisa took a deep breath. "You're right." And then she made a surprising proposal. "Let's create a preferential care program for seniors. And I want you on the creative team. As a consultant. Young people need to hear what your generation is saying." Emily hadn't expected it. Her eyes filled with tears. It was the beginning of a concrete transformation. And she was part of it. But while all this was happening, an old envelope, forgotten for years in a drawer in Walter's house, re-emerged from the shadows. Emily found it while searching for a document to help her grandfather with the bank paperwork. The envelope was yellowed, sealed with old wax. And the strangest thing, it had her name handwritten on it, Emily Grace Bennett. Walter, seeing the envelope, paled. He sat slowly in the chair and put his hand to his chest. "This envelope, your grandmother wrote it. She asked me to give it to you at the right time. And perhaps that time has come." Emily fell silent. Her breath caught in her chest. Her hand trembled as she opened the envelope. And inside was a letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. Maggie always wrote with care, as if each word had been shaped with love. "My sweet Emily, if you're reading this, it's because something very important is happening in your life. And I want you to know that God has chosen you for something greater than you can imagine. Never accept silence in the face of injustice. You are light." Emily wept as she read each line. But there was more. Inside the letter was a small key, tied with a gold ribbon. "This key opens a drawer in the old desk in our farmhouse, where I have hidden something very precious to you, something that will remind you of who you are, and where the strength that courses through your veins came from." The letter ended with a biblical quote, "Justice will roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." Amos 5 verse 24. The next day, Emily and Walter traveled to the old farmhouse where Maggie had lived for years. The house had long been closed, but still stood. Nature had taken over, but the family's heart still beat there. They found the desk in the room that had once been Grandma's. Walter helped open the drawer with the key, and what they found left them both speechless. Inside the drawer was a small trunk filled with old photos, letters exchanged between Maggie and young people she had helped over the years, and a notebook with prayer notes for each person. It was like a diary of faith. Emily leafed through it carefully, and with each name, she recognized stories her grandfather had told. But the most impactful was a letter, addressed to the future of the Bennett family. It was as if Maggie knew that one day her granddaughter would face something great. And there, in that letter, she left advice on courage, dignity, and faith. Don't let the bitterness of the world harden your heart, Emily. Injustice exists, but you can be God's answer to combat it with love. And when everything seems dark, remember, a single candle can break the darkness. Emily, moved, decided to use all that to fuel a larger project. She would create, together with the bank and the Christian Channel, a national campaign to respect the elderly, using her grandfather's story as a symbol. But she knew this was just the beginning. There was still a piece of this puzzle that wasn't clear. Something her grandmother's letter hinted at, but didn't fully explain. And that's when she noticed, at the bottom of the trunk, a handwritten note, with an unfamiliar name. A name that belonged to no relative. And an address. She showed it to her grandfather. Walter paled. That name, that man saved my life in Vietnam. But I thought he'd been dead for decades. Emily looked at her grandfather. What if he's alive? What if there's something that still needs to be said between you two? Lisa was no ordinary manager. At 43, she carried an impeccable reputation. Firm, organized, and relentlessly efficient. But behind the elegant blazers and controlled speech was a woman who had also faced life's hardships. The daughter of a Baptist pastor and the granddaughter of an Alabama seamstress, Lisa learned early on that faith doesn't exclude struggle, it strengthens it. The moment she saw Walter trapped outside the bank, something inside her stirred. It wasn't just professional outrage. It was personal. It was as if the scene had opened a scar she'd hidden for years. And when she recognized Maggie in the photo inside Walter's wallet, it all came flooding back. The frightened 8-year-old girl who nearly drowned at the church retreat. That child still lived inside her. She walked down the stairs determined, but with a conflicted heart. The bank had rules. And she was held accountable for numbers, results, and goals. But that day, Lisa understood there was something more important than any performance metric: dignity. And she wasn't willing to fail in the face of it. When she met Emily, she saw not just a courageous granddaughter, but a reflection of herself. I need to do more than apologize, she thought. And then she made a risky decision. She temporarily suspended branch services and called all employees to an internal meeting, with all customers still present. Today, we're all going to learn something no banking course has taught, she said, her voice firm. The audience was silent, their eyes attentive. Lisa began by speaking about the importance of respect. But her speech soon took a more personal turn. When I was 8 years old, I almost drowned. A woman saved me. Her name was Maggie Bennett. At the time, I didn't understand what she represented. Today, recognizing this photo, I realize she didn't just save my life. She saved my worldview. And I refuse to allow her legacy to be ignored. Walter, sitting in the back, lowered his head, overcome with emotion. Emily held his hand. Lisa, her voice now breaking, continued. It's not enough to have an inclusion protocol. We need empathy. We need presence. We need humanity. This man isn't just a client. He's part of this city's history. He's part of my history. A reverent silence filled the room. But amidst the commotion, a figure stood up among the customers, a blonde woman in her 60s named Karen. She stared at Walter, her eyes wide. Excuse me, but this gentleman, he was a friend of my father's. I remember him. You used to bring apples to the hospital where my father was admitted. My father never forgot that. Walter smiled. John McClary. Was that his name? The woman nodded tearfully. Yes. How do you remember that? Walter replied, because he shared with me the oranges the doctors wouldn't let me eat. Light laughter spread. The atmosphere began to warm in a new way. Memories, now, were the threads that wove a new web between everyone present. Lisa took a deep breath. There was still something that needed to be said. She looked at the security guards. Marshall. Brandon. Come here. The two approached, visibly tense. Today you learned that blindly following orders can cost someone their dignity. But you also learned that change is possible. And change begins with recognition. She invited them to apologize, not just to Walter, but to everyone there. Marshall stepped forward. Ladies and gentlemen, I was instructed to follow protocols that I now understand were flawed. But it wasn't just the protocol. It was me. It was my judgment, my pride. And for that, I apologize. Brandon, overcome with emotion, added, "We thought we were protecting the bank, but we forgot to protect the people." The applause erupted spontaneously. Lisa then revealed that, from that day forward, all employees would undergo training focused on humane care, with a Christian approach, focusing on the principles of compassion, acceptance, and active listening. Not because it's a good idea, but because it's right. Because it's biblical. She quoted Proverbs 31 verse 9, "Open your mouth, judge righteously, and defend justice for the poor and needy." Emily, sitting next to her grandfather, felt she was witnessing something greater than herself. Something that could only have come from God. But there was more. Walter had asked for a moment to speak. Lisa handed him the microphone. With slow steps he stood, looked around, and said, "My wife taught me not to raise my voice, but to raise my soul. Today, you have lifted my soul. Thank you." And then, from the back of the room, a young staff member who hadn't spoken before stood up. "Can I say something?" Lisa nodded. "My name is Rachel, and I was raised by my grandparents. I grew up seeing my grandfather ignored everywhere. Today, for the first time, I saw what happens when someone says, 'Enough is enough.'" "Thank you for that." Applause again. And discreet tears. At the end of the meeting, Lisa did something symbolic. She asked everyone to hug someone they didn't know. The simple gesture generated shy smiles, unexpected encounters, and a breaking down of barriers. Emily hugged Rachel. Marshall hugged Karen. Even Hawthorne, who was watching from above, hesitantly came down and shook Walter's hand in a gesture of reconciliation. But in that group hug, Lisa still carried something in her heart. A doubt. A memory. Something that had been bothering her ever since she saw Maggie's photo. There was a long history between their families. Something that connected them in a deeper way than she had ever publicly stated. Something that was about to be uncovered, and that would change the way everyone there viewed the past. When Lisa returned Walter's wallet, something made her pause for a second. Her eyes fell on a small, yellowed clipping held by a paperclip at the bottom of the document compartment. It was so inconspicuous that, at first glance, it seemed like just an unimportant piece of paper. But there was a word handwritten in blue ink that made her heart race. "Promise, promise." Lisa asked permission to take a closer look. Walter nodded, confused. She carefully removed the paper and unfolded it. It was an old, handwritten note, dated 1969. The handwriting was feminine and elegant, and it began, "If one day the world forgets the value of our elders, may someone remember this promise, never to leave them behind. Love, Maggie." Silence filled the room. Walter recognized the handwriting immediately. "She wrote this the night our first granddaughter was born. She said to me, 'The world is changing, Walt. But there are some things that can't change. Respect. Care. Memory.'" Lisa held the note as if it were sacred. But what took her breath away was the back of the paper. On it, Maggie had drawn a small symbol, shaped like a cross with 3 petals. Lisa clapped her hand over her mouth. "That symbol. I've seen it before." She ran to her bag and pulled out an old prayer book, inherited from her grandmother. Inside, a page contained the same symbol and a dedication, "To Lisa, with love, Maggie Bennett." The room was shocked. Emily stood up. "Wait, your grandmother knew mine?" Lisa nodded, thrilled. They had been childhood friends. Missionaries together, in the same church group in Idaho. Maggie had taken Lisa's grandmother in when she was widowed at a young age. The two created a support network among Christian women that would later help hundreds of others. Lisa grew up hearing stories about a strong woman named Maggie. But only now did she realize that it was the same Maggie Walter loved. Emily, with tears in her eyes, said, "So this promise is an inheritance." Walter held the note like a reliquary. She knew. She knew that one day the world would try to erase our history. But she also knew that the truth always finds a way back. Lisa, overcome with emotion, urged everyone to come closer. The story was taking a different turn. At that moment, something deeply touched the customers and employees present. The detail in Walter's wallet wasn't just a romantic note, it was a seed. And that seed was now germinating there, in the form of reconciliation, understanding, and a new beginning. A detail that had remained hidden for years, waiting for the right moment. And that moment had arrived. But the revelation didn't stop there. Inside the wallet was a small, antique coin, wrapped in clear plastic. Lisa asked about it. Walter said, "This coin was given to me by a Vietnamese soldier. He said it was a symbol of peace between enemies." Lisa held up the coin. "You never told that story?" He replied, "No. Because I never thought people would care." Emily smiled. "But today, Grandpa, everyone wants to hear." And there, Walter began to tell one of the most impactful stories of his youth. During the war, during an ambush, he got separated from his team and ended up captured. But instead of being killed, he was cared for by a man named Bao. An enemy turned friend. It was he who gave him the coin. The most striking detail: Bao also had family in the United States. And after the war, he wrote a letter asking for help finding his relatives here. Walter tried for years, without success. But now, with the right tools, perhaps Emily could help. Lisa, hearing this, said, "Let's find this family. If Bao saved you, it's time for you to give it back to someone." Amid the commotion, a young employee commented, "This all started with one small detail, and it turned into a revolution." Walter looked at her tenderly. God always starts with the little things. A mustard seed, a coin, a promise. And then everyone looked back at the note. It was as if it carried a silent anointing. Something that connected past, present, and future. Emily suggested, "Let's digitize this. And turn this promise into a movement. A project to value seniors. Let's spread this across the country." Lisa agreed immediately. "We can use the bank's infrastructure. Create spaces for listening, support, prayer, and companionship. Not just for clients. For everyone." And thus was born the seed of something much bigger. That afternoon, the bank didn't return to normal operations. It transformed. Customers volunteered. Employees asked to participate in the project. Even Mr. Hawthorne, the director, moved, offered to help with resources and publicity. "I grew up without grandparents," he said. "Today I understand what I lost. And I don't want other children to grow up without hearing those voices." Walter's wallet was placed in an acrylic box as a symbol of the project. And on the agency wall, a phrase from Maggie's letter was emblazoned in gold letters, "Never leave them aside." But while everyone was celebrating, Emily was still thinking about the note with the unknown name that she had found at the bottom of the trunk in the farmhouse. The name on the note was Michael Aaron Lewis. Emily had no idea who it was, but the address underneath indicated a small town in rural Georgia. When she showed it to her grandfather, Walter was silent for a few seconds. His gaze wandered far away, as if searching for something trapped in a forgotten corner of his memory. Then he murmured, "He was my best friend, until the day he disappeared without a trace." Emily's eyes widened. "You never talked about him." Walter sighed. "Because it hurt so much. Michael and I served together, we went through difficult times. And then, simply, he disappeared. I blamed myself for years, thinking maybe I'd failed him." That shook Emily. She knew this was another chapter that needed to be faced. And urgently. They decided to investigate. With the help of the Christian channel that was reporting on the bank, they managed to locate the town on a map. It was a small place called Glenwood. The address still existed, but no one knew if Michael lived there. Emily and Walter embarked on an unexpected journey, crossing dusty roads and landscapes that looked like something out of an old movie. Arriving in town, they found a simple house with a wooden porch and flowers planted in recycled cans. A white-haired woman greeted them. "Michael. He lives here, yes. But he's in the nursing home on the other side of town. He had a stroke 2 years ago and can't speak properly anymore. But he still smiles, every now and then. Walter swallowed hard. Can you take me to him? In the nursing home, the scent of lavender and hand sanitizer mingled with the soft melody of a radio playing Christian songs. Michael sat in a wheelchair, staring out the window. When he saw Walter enter, his eyes filled with tears. He didn't speak. He simply held out his hand, trembling. Walter approached, knelt, and said, "I'm sorry, brother. I took a while, but I'm here." Emily watched from afar, her heart heavy. There was something sacred about that scene. It was the reunion of two men marked by time, but united by something that not even oblivion could erase. Michael began to cry silently. Walter held his hand and began to pray right then and there, asking God to restore what the years had taken away. A nursing home worker approached and said, "Mr. Lewis doesn't talk much. But when he sees old photos, he gets very emotional." Emily then showed a photo of the church camp, with Maggie and Michael in the background. Upon seeing the image, Michael uttered just one word, "Promise." Walter was shocked. He still remembers. Emily began visiting Michael frequently. She discovered that he had kept several notebooks before his stroke, recording his memories, his pain, and his prayers. Among the papers was a letter he never sent, addressed to Walter. Emily read it aloud, and Walter could barely hold back the tears. "You've saved me more times than you know. I just wanted to say thank you. You were my family." The letter revealed details Walter had never known. Michael had tried to find him for years, but after the stroke, he became reclusive. He felt ashamed. He thought he would no longer be recognized, that his value had vanished. Walter embraced him as if trying to stitch together the torn years. A man's worth does not fade with time. God does not forget his children. This visit rekindled something in Walter. He began to talk more about his past. He told stories of meeting Maggie, of Sunday services at sunset, of sleepless nights during the war, and of a very specific moment, when, according to him, he heard God's voice for the first time. It was in a rice field, alone, lying in the mud. And he said to me, "You will return, and you will be a bridge between generations." Emily listened to this with tears in her eyes. "Grandpa, you've always been that bridge. Only now, everyone is crossing with you." They decided to record short videos of Walter telling these stories and posting them on social media. What happened was unexpected. Thousands of elderly people began sending messages, sharing their own forgotten memories. A movement was born. The project was called Legacy of Light. With support from the bank, the Christian channel, and the local community, they created a platform where seniors could share their stories in video, text, or audio. Entire families began to discover entire chapters of their ancestors' lives that had never been told. And all because of one detail, a promise, and a reunion. Lisa, the manager, helped curate the content. She said, "This is more than a project. It's a national reconciliation with time." Even Director Hawthorne began visiting the agencies, encouraging each to create a memory space with photos, letters, and stories from older clients. The change was real, and it began to touch even the hardest hearts. Emily couldn't stop. She wanted to dig deeper. She began to study her own family history, and it was in an old album, stored in a box in the attic, that she found a black-and-white photo that stopped her in her tracks. It was Maggie, hugging a smiling black child. On the back of the photo, a phrase, "My son of my heart. May God protect him." Emily had never heard of him. He took the photo to his grandfather. Walter was silent for several seconds. "That's the part of the story we never told. Because back then, it wasn't safe. Maggie had a baby before she met me. A baby she gave to a Christian family who promised to care for him. But she always called him her son. And she prayed for him every day." Emily felt like she was part of a divine soap opera. "And do you know what happened to him?" Walter shook his head. "We lost touch. It was all very difficult back then. But maybe now we can." Emily promised, "I'll find this man, Grandpa. Maggie's son. He's part of our history. And he needs to know that." And while Emily began this new search, something surprising was happening on the other side of the country. A pastor at a church in Portland, Oregon, came across the photo in one of the Legacy of Light project posts. And he recognized the face. It was his adoptive father, now deceased, who had been raised under the name Elijah. He contacted her immediately. "My grandmother told me that my adoption was a gift from a very special woman. Could it have been Maggie?" Emily and Walter traveled there. When they met the pastor, now in his 50s, the impact was indescribable. His smile, his eyes. It was like looking at a male version of Maggie. And when they heard him sing an old gospel hymn that Maggie loved, everyone was certain. The forgotten past had finally been restored. But there was still something Emily needed to discover, something Maggie had written on a final page of the diary kept at the farm. A clue, almost a riddle, that could change everything once again. Maggie's diary, kept for decades in the secret drawer of her old desk, ended with a page that seemed to have been written urgently. The handwriting was the same, firm, fluid, but the words seemed to carry greater weight. Emily only noticed the detail upon rereading it for the third time. In the bottom corner, well hidden beneath a fold in the page, was a small dove-shaped symbol. And next to it, an enigmatic sentence: "Not everything that is hidden is forgotten. When the time comes, follow the voice of truth." That sentence echoed in Emily's heart like a divine whisper. Something was still unfinished. She gathered the notes, letters, and photos in one place, trying to connect the dots. Then she remembered something. The dove symbol was also engraved on an old bracelet that Walter kept in a crate in the basement, along with other wartime memorabilia. It was a fine silver bracelet, which he always said was a gift he couldn't explain. Carefully, Emily picked up the bracelet and carried it to the bench. Lisa froze when she saw the symbol. "This bracelet, it's from the missionary organization where my grandmother and Maggie worked. I thought they were all destroyed in a fire at the community center in 1977. Emily looked at her grandfather. Walter looked shocked. "So she was part of something bigger?" Lisa nodded. "Much larger. These women created a secret support network for widows, orphans, veterans, and immigrants. They acted discreetly, because not all cities welcomed women leading Christian-based social causes at that time." Emily couldn't decide whether to cry or smile. Was Maggie one of the founders? Lisa replied reverently, "She was the soul of it all." The truth began to emerge with a force no one expected. A lost file, sent by a former Methodist pastor in North Carolina, reached Emily days later. It was a letter written by Maggie and two other women, describing the founding of an underground shelter for abandoned children during the 1970s recession. They used code names. Maggie signed herself Southern Star. In the letter, Maggie spoke of anonymous donations she received from a Springfield banker, Lisa's grandfather. He had funded part of the operation without anyone knowing. It was as if the past of both families were intertwined in sacred secrets. Emily, feeling the weight of the discovery, gathered everyone at the agency: Walter, Lisa, Hawthorne, the staff, and some of the project's new supporters. There, she read the letter aloud. And each sentence revealed that Maggie wasn't just a woman of faith. She was a silent leader in a network of care that saved lives for over 2 decades. Walter wiped away tears. "She did all this, and yet she'd come home with a smile, cooking our dinner, praying with me. And I never knew." Lisa added, "My grandfather knew. And when he died, he left a letter saying that true wealth is what is built in secret, guided by God." Now it all makes sense. Emily had a bold idea: let's create an exhibition. A memorial in honor of these women. And let's invite other families to find out if their grandmothers were also part of the network. The impact was immediate. Hundreds of people began writing, sending photos, objects, and stories of women they had secretly helped for decades. And they all bore the same dove symbol. It was as if an invisible legion was finally being revealed. The truth that emerged wasn't just about Maggie. It was about all the voices silenced by time, but not forgotten by God. During one of his local TV interviews, Walter said, "The Bible says, there is nothing covered up that will not be revealed." Luke 12 verse 2, "I thought I knew my wife, but now I know her mission." The reporter was speechless. And viewers, moved, began writing letters to the channel, asking for their own stories to be heard as well. Emily was overwhelmed, but she felt guided by something greater. One night, she dreamed of Maggie sitting beside the piano, just like in old photos. In the dream, Maggie looked at her and said, "Don't stop, my girl. The legacy isn't just mine. Now it's yours." Emily woke with tears in her eyes and decided she needed to do something even deeper. It brought together leaders from churches, communities, banks, and schools. It created the National Invisible Legacy Day, a symbolic date to remember the value of older people and their silent contributions. The proposal was approved by the Springfield City Council and gained national attention. Even the governor issued an official statement recognizing the importance of the movement. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. A gray-bearded man appeared at the agency one Friday morning. He carried a black briefcase full of documents. He introduced himself as Peter Maxwell, a Christian historian who had followed the trail of the Southern Star for over 20 years. "You've just unearthed what I always knew existed but could never prove." Peter showed records, maps, field reports, all proving the existence of the secret aid network. Maggie wasn't just a woman of faith. She was a strategist, a protector of souls. "And what you're doing now is the fulfillment of the prophecy she wrote in her diary." Emily asked, "What prophecy?" Peter opened a marked page, and there it was written, "In due time, the truth will be like the dawn. No one will be able to ignore its light." Everyone fell silent. The weight of it was heavenly. Lisa held the diary reverently. Walter stood slowly and said, "This light now lives in each of us, and we have a responsibility to it." What had been just the story of a man barred from the bank was now the beginning of a spiritual and historic revolution. But Emily still had something in mind. The bracelet with the dove symbol. According to Maggie, there were more than 20 scattered across the country. And each one held a story, a promise, a mission. Emily decided, "I will find them, one by one, and with them, rebuild everything they tried to erase." And little did she know, the next bracelet was closer than she thought, hidden where no one would think to look. Marshall didn't sleep well for several nights. Images of the day he barred Walter haunted him like a constant echo. He relived that moment with shame and regret, realizing it wasn't just a professional failing, it was a moral error. For the first time in years, he found himself confronted with his own hardness, with the pride he had mistaken for authority. He grew up in a home where men didn't cry, where order and discipline were more important than sensitivity. But after that episode, something inside him began to change. He began to observe his clients differently, with more listening, more patience. He discovered stories of suffering and overcoming that he had never imagined. The bank he patrolled like an iron castle now seemed more like a house of prayer. Brandon, the younger security guard, wasn't the same either. Still developing his character, he saw his experience with Walter as a kind of early mirror. What if one day it's my grandfather there? What if it's me, older, being judged by my appearance? These questions pricked him like daily thorns. He sought out Emily and asked to meet with Walter. He needed to apologize, looking her in the eye. Walter welcomed them home with hot coffee and oatmeal cookies baked by Emily. Sitting in the rocking chair, he listened intently to every word. Marshall spoke first, his voice trembling. "I was blind, Mr. Walter. But now I see. And it pains me to know it took me so long." Walter didn't interrupt. He simply nodded slowly, his eyes serene. When he finished, Walter replied sweetly, "Son, God is not moved by force. He is moved by sincere repentance." Brandon held back tears. "I thought it was just a job. But now I understand that every person who walks into that bank carries a story. And it's up to me to be a bridge, not a barrier." Walter extended his hand, squeezing his firmly. "You've learned what many don't learn in a lifetime." Emily, listening to everything, felt something beautiful being born, a new cycle. Inspired by the forgiveness they received, the two security guards began actively participating in the Legacy of Light project. They volunteered to visit nursing homes and speak with the elderly. Gradually, local communities began to see them no longer as cold authority figures, but as transformed men. And this transformation inspired many others. Lisa, moved by the change in the two, decided to propose something new. creating a national security guard training program focused on empathy, active listening, and compassionate service. She asked Marshall and Brandon to be the first instructors. You know what it's like to make mistakes. And you know what it's like to get back up. That's true leadership. During the first class of the new program, Marshall began by saying, "When we barred Mr. Walter, it wasn't just an old man we kept out. It was wisdom. It was grace. It was history. May that never happen to any of us again." The room fell silent, and a young trainee commented, "I've never seen a boss own up to a mistake like that." Marshall responded, "That's because you haven't seen what regret can do to a man." Brandon told his new colleagues about the Dove bracelet. He said he learned more about courage in that moment of humiliation than in all the safety courses he'd ever taken. Being strong means apologizing. Being a man means protecting the truth, even when it tears you apart. The quote went viral. And soon, videos of the talk were being shared by churches, businesses, and NGOs across the country. Emily, watching all this blossom, increasingly understood that Grandma Maggie's seed was sprouting on fertile ground. But what no one expected was that another security guard, who had worked at that agency many years ago, would come forward with information that would change everything. His name was Jacob, and he had been retired for over a decade. Seeing Walter's story on TV, he decided to reach out to Emily. "I have something I've kept for years. I didn't know if it was right to show it. But now, I understand that this truth belongs to you." It was a sealed envelope, embossed with the dove symbol. Inside was a handwritten letter from Maggie, addressed to an unidentified recipient, but with a cryptic phrase, "If you find this letter, it means there is still time." The letter spoke of a secret hidden within the bank itself. An old safe, built even before the major renovation, with restricted access and no digital records. According to Maggie, inside were files, documents, and letters exchanged between the women in the support network. Emily and Lisa, with the bank's permission, went there with a security technician. The safe existed. And what was inside? No one was prepared to see. Maps of routes used to deliver food to widows, records of services provided to abandoned veterans, letters from women who had been rescued from abuse, photos of secret meetings in church basements. It was a silent, parallel history that had sustained entire communities for decades. Lisa looked at Emily and said, "This right here is the treasure of faith, a gospel lived out in practice." They decided to create a community museum within the bank itself, a space open to the city, where everyone could experience for themselves the power of quiet Christian care. Marshall and Brandon became the museum's volunteer guides. And at the end of each visit, they would say, "This place taught us that dignity is a right. But repentance is a miracle." On the day of the museum's opening, Walter cut the ceremonial ribbon with trembling but steady hands. "I thought I would be forgotten. But I discovered that when truth is planted in love, it flourishes even in deserts." The audience gave a standing ovation. Emily whispered, "This isn't over yet, Grandpa. There's still something to find." And Walter replied, his eyes brimming with tears, "And we will find it, my daughter. Together." Because in that story, even regret served as a bridge. And the next bridge would lead to an unexpected gesture, something no one saw coming, but which would transform even more hearts. The day was clear, the sky cloudless, as if even nature had prepared for this moment. The bank's main lobby was now transformed. Where before there were only tellers and lines, there were now panels with photos, excerpts from letters, Bible verses, and a huge mural with Maggie's quote, "Never leave them aside." It was the day of the memorial's official opening ceremony. And no one could have imagined the lesson that would be taught there, in front of everyone. Walter sat in the chair of honor, wearing his inseparable brown hat, neatly dressed, and his eyes brimming with tears since early morning. Emily was organizing the final details with Lisa, who, in recent days, had become more than a manager, now an ally, almost family. People began to arrive slowly, local residents, volunteers, reporters, pastors, children holding flowers. When the ceremony began, it was Emily who welcomed everyone. This place was once the scene of pain, but today, it becomes an altar of healing. She introduced Walter, briefly telling the story of the bracelet, the letter, the dove symbol. But then she handed the microphone to Lisa. And that's when the real lesson began. Lisa took a deep breath. She looked at the employees, the long-time customers, the curious newcomers. For so long, we thought our job was to protect safes. But today I understand that our true role is to protect people, to care for stories, to safeguard what truly matters: dignity, faith, memory. She quoted Proverbs 4:7, "Wisdom is the principal thing, therefore get wisdom, and with all your getting get understanding." And then, pointing to Walter, she said, "This man taught us that there's no such thing as wasted time when we choose to forgive, that the voices of our grandparents can still guide our steps. That silent faith is more powerful than any title, protocol, or company policy." The emotion was palpable. Lisa paused, holding back tears. But the most powerful lesson was yet to come. Walter stood up slowly and asked for the microphone. Silence fell over everyone. "I want to tell you something I've never told anyone. When I was barred from here, inside, I broke. Outside, I remained calm. But my soul cracked. I felt useless, invisible. But that very day, when the door opened, I realized it wasn't just the bank that was closing me off. I had also closed my heart to the world." He looked at Marshall and Brandon. "These two men taught me that regret can rewrite history. Lisa showed me that courage has no age. Emily reminded me that the future can indeed honor the past." The emotion was widespread. People wept. Others recorded everything in absolute silence. And then Walter took something out of his pocket, a small, velvet box. Inside was an antique silver ring with an inscription inside, "To serve is to love." He explained, "This ring belonged to Maggie. She wore it every day, even after arthritis, even after losing strength in her hands. She said, 'As long as I can wear this ring, I can serve someone. Today, I want to give it back to the world.'" With a slow gesture, he placed the ring on a small wooden statuette carved by a local artist, a female figure holding a dove. The symbol of the network was now immortalized there. "This ring is no longer mine. It belongs to all who choose to serve, even in silence, even without recognition, because that is what transforms the world." At that moment, a group of young people from the local church began to sing "Amazing Grace" in chorus. The room was filled with an almost palpable presence. It was as if Maggie were there, smiling, hugging each one. And suddenly, a 91-year-old woman named Helen stood up from the audience. She walked to the front, holding an envelope. She looked at Emily and said, "I also received a letter with the dove symbol. I never understood what it was. I kept it out of fear. But now, I know I was part of this network." Opening the envelope revealed another story, another connection, another restored soul. The microphone passed to her, and then to another, and another. The ceremony turned into a chorus of testimonies. Lisa, overcome with emotion, turned to Emily and said, "The lesson is not only in pain overcome, but in pain shared." Emily replied, "And in love multiplied." Walter, seated again, watched with shining eyes. "She was right, my daughter. Maggie. She knew one day this would come to light. Not for personal glory, but to remind the world that service is the greatest act of faith." Before the ceremony ended, something surprising happened. A group of teenagers, students from a nearby public school, handed Emily a project. A documentary. They had used the material from Walter's story, the Women's Network, the bracelet, and the dove to create a short film called The Promise That Remained. And they asked for permission to show it in schools in the region. Walter looked at Emily. "See, the next generation has already taken up the torch." And she, with tears in her eyes, replied, "Because you held on tight, Grandpa, even when the world tried to extinguish the light." Everyone gave a standing ovation. But Emily knew there was one last gesture. Something that needed to happen. Something that would change the essence of that place. Forever. The bank was silent. It wasn't the silence of banking routine, but the silence of something sacred about to happen. Emily stood before everyone, holding a pale blue envelope. It was the last object found among Maggie's things. Walter didn't know what it was. Nor did Lisa. Nor did anyone else. She looked around, took a deep breath, and said, This envelope was found sewn inside the lining of an old purse. It was hidden. And I believe it's because this moment needed to come. She opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a single, handwritten sheet. Maggie's handwriting was still there, steady, even with the passing of time. If this letter is read in public, it's because the cycle has begun. Truth has overcome fear. And the time has come to take the next step. A place of pain transforms into healing when someone has the courage to love more than judge. So, here's my final instruction. The bank must stop being just a bank and become a home. Everyone looked at each other. Lisa stood up, took the paper from Emily, and continued reading. Every Friday, open your doors to those who hunger for soul. Make this place a refuge, an altar, a table. Nourish with stories, with listening, with prayer. Be bread for those who walk empty. Be light for those who have grown accustomed to darkness. Total silence. Walter cried like a child. She already knew. Lisa then took the microphone and declared, starting next week, this bank branch will open its doors every Friday night as a community center. We will have music, sharing, prayer, and a free dinner for seniors and vulnerable families. The applause echoed like holy thunder. But there was more. Emily walked over to the mural with Maggie's quote and revealed what she had secretly prepared, a new, gold sign to be affixed to the bank's entrance. She read aloud, First Community Agency of Hope, where faces come before numbers. The crowd cheered. But it was what Walter did next that became a lasting impression. With slow steps, he walked to the memorial vault. He pulled out a small wooden box and removed his Navy Veterans Medal. It was his most precious relic. This medal represents the battles I've won. But what I experienced here was a greater battle. Against oblivion. Against pride. Against indifference. And I didn't win that alone. That's why this medal now belongs here. He placed it reverently on the wooden altar Lisa had carved in honor of the invisible servants of faith. Everyone wept. But it was at that moment that an 87-year-old woman named Ruth took the stage. She took the microphone with trembling hands. Mr. Walter, I'm one of the children Maggie saved. I was 5 years old. She hid me in a basement with 2 other girls until my mother was released from an abusive shelter. I never found her afterward. But today, I found you. Thank you. Walter fell to his knees. Emily ran to him, hugging him. It was as if God had tied up all the loose ends in a single gesture. A lifetime of Maggie's being honored there, in front of everyone. A story of faith that didn't ask for a stage, but now shone brighter than a spotlight. Lisa declared, This is the new beginning. And we're going to take it nationwide. In the days that followed, agencies across the state began replicating the model. Churches joined forces. Schools created projects inspired by the story. The students' documentary won an award. And the dove symbol began appearing on walls, T-shirts, and murals, as a silent sign of those who chose to serve. But one afternoon, Emily received a letter in the mail. A plain envelope, with no return address. Inside was just a photo of another bracelet with the dove symbol, and a note, This one's in Kansas. Look for Grace. She knows the next step. Emily smiled. She showed her grandfather. Walter simply said, The road continues, my daughter. And so, that story, which began with a closed door, now opened doors to the world. Because a gesture, when guided by love, doesn't end. It multiplies. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this story touched your heart. Maybe it was Walter's gaze, full of dignity. Maybe it was Emily's courage. Or perhaps Maggie's words, written decades ago, but as vivid as if spoken today. What matters is that you felt, and when we feel, it's God calling us to something greater. How many times have you felt invisible? Or seen someone ignored just because they seemed old, weak, or slow? How many stories do you know that were never told, because no one had the patience to listen? Perhaps right now, there's a treasure right next to you, hidden in your mother's smile, your father's silence, or the wrinkled hands of someone who raised you. Don't let this legacy disappear. The Bible teaches us that true religion is caring for orphans and widows, James 1 verse 27. And caring starts with listening, with time, with presence. Maybe you don't have a project, an agency, or a TV channel, but you have a heart. And that's enough to start something extraordinary. Because the world doesn't change with great revolutions. It changes with small gestures, made with sincere love. Now I ask you, what story have you been leaving behind? Who in your life still needs to be heard? What can you do today to start this transformation in your own home? Tell me here in the comments. Have you ever seen or experienced anything similar to this story? What would you do in Emily's place? Or in Walter's place? Let's talk. Because these stories are ours. And each sharing can light another flame. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. This helps me continue to share real stories that transform lives and fuel faith. And share this video with someone who needs a reminder of the value they carry, even in silence. May God bless you with health, light, wisdom, and discernment. May He give you eyes to see the invisible, ears to hear what the world keeps silent, and the strength to make a difference. Because the legacy of love begins with a single step. And maybe yours is now.